Technologies and Peacebuilding and Prevention virtual workshop. And today we're really inspired to be with you here and especially to learn lessons from the humanitarian sector. This is the fourth International Practitioners Workshop for the Data for Peace initiative. Some of you may have joined us previously in New York and The Hague or online earlier this year in May. But if this is your first time, welcome to our growing community of practice, linking together governments, private sector, civil society, academia, and multilateral organizations. Can I just note quickly for those of you who are joining that we are making this broadcast available in English, French, and Spanish. And so if you are more comfortable listening in French or Spanish, please go back to the agenda and you'll find below the current English entry, a place to click where you can join the broadcast in French and Spanish. Wonderful. So why are we here today? Well, I'm here because as someone who's been working in the prevention and peacebuilding space for about 2 decades, I know that our field has a long way to go to understand both the promise and the pitfalls of emerging technologies for solving practical challenges that we face. And rather than reinventing the wheel, it's really crucial to capture lessons from adjacent fields that are, I would say, in advance of us. So we all know that we should be working across the humanitarian development peacebuilding nexus, the HDP nexus, particularly in fragile contexts. However, I think that many of us still struggle to understand what this means operationally in practice. That said, there are 3 major trends happening now that make attention to the nexus and learning from one another especially critical at this time. The first is the COVID-19 pandemic, which has created compounding risks downstream from the primary health effects. We are indeed witnessing growing instability around the world, including a rising number of conflicts and increased social unrest, especially after that initial lockdown period in 2020 last year, as recent data from Uppsala and from ACLED have indicated. The second is climate change and the coming crises and shocks this may create. While we don't have clear evidence on links between climate change and conflict, we do know that climate shocks exacerbate risks across the HDP nexus, including risks for conflict, as we see rising food and water scarcity, as well as more people migrating, more people on the move. And the third is rising inequality of all sorts, both within countries, but also now acutely in relation to the access to vaccines and also access to financing, particularly for middle and low income countries to help them deal with the effects of the pandemic. Things like social safety nets, if they existed, are fraying and people are being left behind. These are all nexus issues. But across these major trends is the ongoing revolution in the scale and the velocity of data and information, which grows daily. And this raises the level of challenge and urgency for us for capturing lessons on how data-driven approaches can be best used. Ultimately, what we seek here are practical solutions to practical challenges. And here I have to admit that although humanitarian and peacebuilding actors often share the same fragile and conflict-affected spaces, working with similarly vulnerable groups, our objectives may not always neatly overlap. Peacebuilding practitioners have to find ways to build trust and social cohesion in fractured societies. Humanitarians, while not oblivious to these goals, obviously, they must focus on alleviating suffering and delivering life-saving goods and services. So where do we meet? I think it's in that space around solutions, around do no harm, and the recognition that we have to get much, much better at anticipation rather than reaction. And this is where we hope to exchange lessons learned, both positive and negative, around the role of very exciting, but also potentially harmful technologies for solving practical challenges, things like chatbots, remote sensing, artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, and the many other issues that you're going to hear about today and tomorrow at this meeting. So stopping here, I'd like to acknowledge a very important person who's really been the engine behind this event. That is Branka Panic, our CIC non-resident fellow who's once again led the creation of this workshop. I'd also like to thank our assistant, Sarah Tahir, and our communications manager, Symphony Chow, for their unfailing support. I'd also like to say a thank you to the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs for their partnership for our entire Data for Peace work, not just this meeting. And I'd also like to recognize the UN OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data for their support of this workshop. So with that, I'd like to invite each of those entities to say a few words. And so I'm delighted to introduce first Maria Schuurman, who is the Director for Stabilization and Humanitarian Aid at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So over to you, Mariette, and thank you.
Thank you, Paige, and thank you all for being with us. I think it's a very topical subject to talk about data sensitivity, but also about lessons learned. And as you said, from the different spheres, there's a lot we can learn from each other. So, and I think, as you said, there's a lot to learn from humanitarian field, but also the other way around. And they meet around resilience and prevention and anticipation. So we need to learn from each other. So both peace building and humanitarian aid deal with vulnerable communities, those left furthest behind in very fragile and unstable settings. And in both those contexts, data and emerging technologies provide both life-saving opportunities, but also grave risks. And there are many opportunities for collaboration. Where possible, obviously, we need to share information. That means sharing best practices, but also sharing knowledge on, for example, data exchange and trigger mechanisms or analytical models. And above all, avoid duplication. Maybe the most important lesson to share from the humanitarian field is that people first means using data and emerging technologies to enable more effective, timely, dignified aid and ensure accountability to affected people. But most importantly, people first means ethics and data responsibility first. So 4 notions I would like to highlight there. Sensitivity of information. Sensitivity of information is prone to change and always highly dependent on the context in terms of place and time. But that's especially true in fragile and unstable contexts, which makes it very hard to predict where future sensitivity lies. For example, 20 years ago, it wasn't obvious that the location of girls' schools in Nigeria could become sensitive information. So therefore, it's important to share best practices, especially when it comes to biometrics and other personal data. The work on data responsibility is still evolving, and the next 2 days will undoubtedly give important insights on data responsibility in the humanitarian and peace building settings. I think an important lesson we can share is to be extremely cautious and reserved in the collection, use, and storage of data. Collect and use only what is necessary. And finally, invest in capacity on all levels of implementation. So I'm very pleased to see Sarah Telford of the OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, who will be speaking in this session too, because many of our examples and best practices on data and emerging technologies come from our partnership with the OCHA Data Center. So I very much look forward to hear her thoughts. Thank you, Paige.
No, and thank you, Mariette, for those comments about accountability, about people first, ethics. These are all issues that we'll be taking up over the next couple of days. And with that, I'm really delighted to turn over to Sarah Telford, who is the lead at UN OCHA's Center for Humanitarian Data. Sarah.
Great. Well, thank you. And nice to see you, Mariette. And thank you for that compliment and really the investment that the Netherlands has made in data and tech is an example, I think, for all of the donor governments and others. So thank you. I'll keep my welcome brief because I'm also on the panel and I'll be speaking more, but just to say that we're honored to be partners, and thank you for including us in this. And I think the center has now been around for 4 years. We launched in 2017, and our data platform, the Humanitarian Data Exchange, was preceded that. It was created in 2014. So we have been at this for a while. Sometimes I feel like couldn't possibly have anything new to say. But there are some really exciting areas ahead. I think specifically around the data responsibility issue, and we've had success in the last couple of years in writing and agreeing on guidance. And I think with my colleague Stuart Campo, who leads that work at the center, really now focusing on adoption and implementation. And that's where the challenge is, right? How do we really get this mainstreamed into our work? And the tricky issues with working in nexus environments like Sudan, where you have the humanitarian development and peace groups together. And so what does that mean in terms of data sharing and information sharing when the government is involved? So those are some big issues ahead. The other is certainly predictive analytics, which I know I'm excited to hear from Nadia later today from the World Bank and the work that they did on predicting famine, which I thought was really inspiring and actually, led to us creating a work stream here at the center a couple of years ago. And now really looking at OCHA's anticipatory action work. So how can we get ahead of crises to offset the impact on people's lives if we know that a weather event is coming, or if we can take actions to prevent the spread of disease, then we should be doing that now that we have some of the data and the science capabilities. So we're happy to share those experiences with you. And tomorrow we have a couple workshops on data sharing and capacity building, but really looking forward to the conversation. And again, thank you so much for including us in the program. Back to you, Paige.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. And thanks again to both of you for your participation and your support of this event. So now it's time to turn over to our panel. And I'm pleased to welcome everyone here. Sarah is going to be staying with us. And joining Sarah will be Angela Odor-Langati, who is the Executive Director of Ushahidi, Robert Kirkpatrick, who's the Executive Director of UN Global Pulse, and also Patrick Vink, who's the Research Director at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. So this is a really great group of technologists, of data scientists, and also thought leaders in this field who can really, I think, position us for the rest of this workshop. So our topic is Pause, Reflect, Envision, Lessons in Emerging Technologies at the Intersection of Peacebuilding and Humanitarian Action. So hello to all of you. So since we are starting with, the title is Pause, Reflect, Envision. So let's start by pausing. And I'd like to give each of you a kind of opening 2 minutes to talk about why now might be a good moment to pause. Is there a particular urgency of the situation now? And particularly, what is the most critical situation in the world where peace building and prevention actors really should be learning the lessons from the humanitarian sector? So I'd love to start with Angela from Ushahidi. So Angela, I'm going to go over to you first for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Paige. I'll start by thanking the NYU Center on International Cooperation, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as well as the Center for Humanitarian Data for having me on today's panel. Thinking about why we need to pause now. Digital technologies have been lauded as being transformative in the field of peace building. Julia Silvana Hofstadter from the University of Duisburg-Eisen's Institute of Development and Peace published a research report in early 2021 whose findings resonated strongly with me based on our work at Ushahidi, and also illustrated how technology helps to provide critical access to information, especially to sources that were previously not accessible before. It also offers an opportunity for strategic communication, increased transparency, and dissemination to a vast audience. One of the most crucial benefits, in my opinion, is innovation in the form of engagement. I think we've seen this more, especially during the pandemic season. Digital spaces such as Clubhouse, Twitter Spaces, Zoom, Skype, Facebook, all of these provide a new platform where people can meet and engage, regardless of the physical locations. I think us being on this panel in a virtual setting is also a huge indication of that. However, there's more to be done to empower local communities and give them agency in the peace building process. We live in a world where people have more access to the internet and platforms for self-expression as well as emerging technologies. So it makes sense that we should not look at ordinary people as incapable of being a part of the decision-making and problem-solving process. What we've seen more often than not is that the local population and ordinary citizens tend to be seen as a means of data extraction rather than being involved in all stages of the peace building process. Technological advancements also bring unintended risks to vulnerable populations and exacerbate existing inequalities as well as discriminatory structures. So we must pause and think about making sure that we're not leaving anyone behind when it comes to technological advancements, but also think about mitigating the risks that are presented by emerging technologies. I look forward to engaging further on this topic during the rest of today's panel, and we'll hand the mic back over to Paige. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Angela, and for highlighting the issue of leaving people behind and seeing vulnerable populations in particular as kind of a source of data extraction. So now I'm going to go over to Robert Kirkpatrick, who is the Executive Director at UN Global Pulse, for his 2-minute reflection. Why should we pause now, Robert?
I think, this is a really interesting moment, and I'm thrilled to be part of this panel and the framing of this effort. I think there's a great deal that can be learned from the humanitarian community for efforts in the arena of peace. The Secretary General's report on the Common Agenda highlights a trend in general of increased armed conflict among population groups starting in 2010. These are not states fighting rebels. This is not traditional warfare. These are armed struggles between groups, right? And the trend has been accelerating, reaching a peak in 2017 with more than 80 non-state conflicts. So this is what a broken social contract looks like, right? The governments of the world, as well as the UN, need to take this into account. On average, it takes 26 years to build institutions capable of sustaining peace. So to address the changing nature of conflict, we need new tools for anticipation that lead to preventative action by governments and leaders and grassroots activists as well. Humanitarian actors, are excellent at articulating the humanitarian deficit, right? But peace building and prevention doesn't have its own equivalent, right? Peace building and prevention need a similar way to forcefully highlight, like, this is what your debt in terms of social cohesion looks like. And we need to be able to do this before you're counting battle deaths, right? So the SG's report on the Common Agenda has trust among populations and between government and its institutions at the core. There's a development response to these frayed social contracts that needs to be aligned with peace-building priorities, but at the same time, new technologies and research methods and approaches are now becoming much more widely available. Social media analysis is going mainstream in the UN. We've seen WHO doing incredibly good work on infodemics. Why can't we kind of copy and paste some of these experiences across the peace building spectrum, looking at social cohesion and hate speech? We've been doing a lot of work, as some may be aware, in radio mining and using automated speech recognition of talk radio shows and news programs to support peacekeeping missions. This is a way to kind of extend what you can do with social media out on the other side of the digital divide. And finally, peace-building actors have picked up the digital mantle since the pandemic and are increasing their focus on the digital sphere as a source of conflict and potentially as a means to address conflict. So on the question of why now, I think at the heart of the approach is the impact of technology on peace and security dynamics, and in the UN's anticipating a rapid deterioration of social cohesion in the years ahead. We need to start asking ourselves, what are the opportunity costs of not knowing what is possible to know, given that these technologies are, and the data sources for them are out there that could allow us to assess social cohesion and strengthen approaches to peace building. So looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Robert. Really appreciate you putting in the context of the Secretary General's report, our common agenda, and his focus on social contracts. So I think that's really critical, and a very kind of practical ideas that you're already bringing up about why can't we copy and paste WHO's infodemic models for sort of peace building purposes or prevention purposes. So that's already an idea that we have from this meeting. So with that, let's go next to Patrick Vink, who's a research director at Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. And welcome, Patrick, and over to you for 2 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. Given the short timeline, I will jump into the kind of 4 points that are very blunt. Each of them should be much more nuanced and deserve a discussion. But for the purpose here of provoking and really highlighting some of these key elements of why now, and drawing on the experience of the humanitarian sector, I think there's 4 elements that came to my mind. One, and it was already highlighted by Angela, but is this kind of growing divide, the failure in the localization agenda around technology, the in fact increased centralization around remote management, around concern for cybersecurity, data protection, that has turned global actors much more inward as opposed to this localization and respect and engagement and consideration for local agency. In part, that has been driven by major progress around data protection, cybersecurity, but these progress have fallen short of a true consideration for a protection agenda. It's been very technical, but it doesn't really put protection at the center of the use of technology, which is certainly concerning in many instances in many countries. The third one is the rise of technology as a service to government among a number of humanitarian and peace-building actors. And in fact, it was just mentioned around the social contract. And it's of course an important idea, but it's also raising important concerns as to what we are leaving behind in terms of data, in terms of capabilities. And we've seen those issues being raised in places like, of course, Afghanistan most recently, but also Bangladesh, for example, in terms of who gets access to what and what kind of technology and the implication that this has. And this kind of brings the fourth point, which is at the higher, more strategic level. It is clear that technology is increasingly at the center of strategic plays, thinking in international relations. Countries are using technology and assistance around technology to governments for strategic political gains. It is clear that the next wars are going to be fought digitally. And so as peace builders, we need to really understand what those tools are, what those weapons are. The role of technology as amplification of misinformation is well known, but we need to go much more beyond that in understanding how technology is changing both the dynamic of war and the dynamic of peace, and that's a big agenda. Did I stay within 2 minutes? I hope. Thank you.
You did. That was great, Patrick. And even managed to get through the 4 points. Each of us, you're right, could be unpacked. Can I highlight there the issue around localization and local agency? And that's, again, another place where I think the humanitarian sector and peace building and prevention work converges, is around those issues. But I think it's really important to unpack over these next couple of days some of the risks and ethical issues that you're raising. So with that, let me give the last 2 minutes over to Sarah Telford. Sarah.
Sure. So, why pause? I think, it's always good to kind of assess where you are. And we, on our team, we have a process of objectives and key results. So every quarter we look at what we're doing and we think about whether we're doing the right thing. And so it's always good to reflect. And I think one thing is that we all get very stuck in our ways in our own spaces, and having these conversations across sector is really valuable. So I'm, as much as wanting to share our work, I want to learn from you all, how are you doing things and how is this really happening in the field? I feel very disconnected from the field because we haven't been able to go, for a couple of years now, and tired of sitting behind a screen and having these conversations. So I think the more that we can hopefully re-engage soon in person in the field and have these conversations, the better. But really for OCHA, I think the one thing that seems unique is the role of OCHA. I mean, we are able to, with our mandate in terms of coordination and the work that we do with the center on data aggregation and setting standards and really setting a direction, isn't necessarily there in the development and the peace space in the same way. And so I think it can get a bit more fragmented probably. And, with the UN data strategy coming to play now, and how do we think beyond humanitarian? What does that look like for us? These are a lot of questions that I think we have, even with anticipatory action. Is that really humanitarian action, or is that something that we can signal, but it's actually for others to take on? And these kind of debates of sort of the scope of humanitarian and where do we come in and where do others come in, I think are hard questions. And not least because this climate crisis is coming, and OCHA is putting out a new report on the climate crisis and humanitarian issues. And I read the draft this week, and it's crushing. I mean, it's really crushing to kind of think what the needs now. Tomorrow, OCHA will launch the Global Humanitarian Overview for 2022. I don't know the figures because they're not shared yet, but last year we had 250 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, 170 million that were targeted for assistance. We asked for $37 billion to help fund that, and got 17 billion. So that's the spread now. It's huge in terms of not really meeting the existing needs. And just to imagine that that's only going to grow in the coming years, I think we really do need to figure out how to work better together, how to learn from each other, and really how to scale some of the great work that's happening. So I'll stop there, and looking forward to continue the discussion.
Great, thanks, Sarah, and thanks to all the panelists for taking that moment to pause and to kind of set this into a larger frame. Let's turn to reflection and maybe start by moving from kind of the big picture down to more practical applications. And I'd be very curious to hear from both Robert and Sarah first, just some reflections on lessons learned about things that have worked well or things that have not worked well, and the lessons that peace building and prevention practitioners could be taking away from that. And it really is, I think, mainly about drawing on your own experience working at UN Global Pulse and also at the Humanitarian Data Center. What are 1 to 2 of those successes or failures? Very important, of course, to learn from failure as well. So maybe, Robert, I'll ask you first and then come to you, Sarah, after.
Sure. Yeah, I know success is a poor teacher, as they say. I think one area that I highlighted in my opening remarks was the area of infodemic management. And we've been working very closely with WHO on disinformation. Disinformation, of course, has a role in conflict as well. But the work that we've been doing with WHO on tracking COVID-related misinformation and addressing it has been very useful for WHO, to the point that they've now built their own data science team and are really kind of institutionalizing this type of work and working to scale it internally. Tracking movements of a population and applying epidemiologic modeling for UNHCR is another area, right? So work all around the world, looking not only at sort of real-time tracking, for example, of flows of refugees, for example, through Europe or across borders, but then looking at kind of how you can do this in terms of context of epidemiology, but also looking at mass migration. The spread of COVID-19 has really sensitized all actors to the need for developing capabilities around machine learning. I mean, like basic statistical methods, basic financial modeling. These are capabilities every bureaucrat has known they have to have for decades. Machine learning's on the list now, and we need to make sure that we have, in every part of every institution, capabilities at minimum to be able to understand whether this is a problem where machine learning has a role to play. Not doing so has a cost in lives, particularly when you look at sort of the impact of misinformation and not being able to get ahead of the curve. But the same logic is going to apply to peace and conflict. In terms of things that didn't work, I mean, one area that in retrospect is always sort of very clear why these things didn't work, but looking at what happens when you bring in machine learning based approaches, right? We know what happens when you come into manufacturing with robots, right? There's a lot of fear that automation is going to take away jobs. Well, if your job is responding to disease outbreaks, and now we can predict and prevent them, right? You're going to have an automatic antibody reaction from people on the ground who are going to see this as a job security threat. And that was an experience that we had where we had a peacekeeping mission where there was a lot of opposition to kind of real-time situational awareness and analysis because it was perceived as possibly taking jobs away from analysts. Senior management buy-in doesn't offer results on its own. You've got to provide the institution with new capabilities and take into account the information needs of the actors on the ground. Any large-scale organization at the same time is going to need to prepare itself for task automation and have a plan for what you do if certain efficiencies are created, so that you don't automatically have people digging in and fighting back. And I think, the new innovation frontier, it's not so much about demonstrating, that we can use anonymized mobile phone call records to assess social cohesion or satellite imagery to track movement of armed groups, but it's more about, what do we do in terms of the impact of those insights on our programming, on our policy, on our operations, on our advocacy? How do we maximize their utility, and how do we address the intrinsically disruptive nature of those changes?
Yeah, great points, Robert. And also kind of being able to think through all of the consequences of utilizing or adopting new technologies, very important. So Sarah, what do you think about this, lessons learned and what's worked well or hasn't worked well in your experience?
Well, I think the data platform that we created, the Humanitarian Data Exchange, is a success. And we started in 2014. We had a couple hundred data sets, a couple partners who were brave enough to share their data on the platform. And now, we have 18,000 data sets, hundreds of partners. Last year, with a spike in kind of use with the COVID crisis, we had 1.3 million people using the platform. So that is a remarkable success within a UN bureaucracy, I have to say. I mean, and had to fight, at every turn to really even just get it created and have it now kind of standing as an example. Even recently with the UN data strategy, kind of a lot more interest in like, how did you do it? And so we wrote a case study, and I'm happy to share that as well, just for people who are creating platforms. And I think there is a lot of that now. Like, how do we create new data sharing platforms where we can putting our data so that it's accessible? And I think as much as possible to tap into these broader platforms. Doesn't have to be HDX, but so that you're not just on your own on a web page, but really linked into a network of data providers, I think is going to be more important. But the way we think about our work, though, is really around this idea of a flywheel, which maybe sounds a bit businessy, but the idea of how do you create momentum? And it was really the data partnerships trust was our flywheel. So people came to us for data. We created these partnerships, and then from that, we created trust. And that just kept looping and has worked. And really the thing that we've added recently, like I said, is the predictive analytics piece, or the use of the data. And it's only accelerated the flywheel, I have to say, because now we're in a position to say, there's problems with this data, or we have these data gaps that we need to fill, or we can't do modeling based on, no data. And it's, I think, helped to generate more momentum, which is great. In terms of failures, I mean, I think data standards in general have been a tough sell. And I think they're a good idea in theory. We have one called the Humanitarian Exchange Language, and then there's also IATI, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, and we've worked on both. And I have to say, they're just very difficult. It's difficult to get adoption. It's difficult to create incentives for use. And, you know, even with IATI, which we recently did a COVID-19 IATI visualization, lots of problems around the quality of the data, the use of the data, the feedback loops, the complexity of the standard. And so, yeah, I think some of that needs to be rethought. I'm not saying we shouldn't have data standards, because obviously it's in our interest as a data aggregator to have standards. But I think that's one place where I've really felt like maybe we're doing something wrong here. So back to you.
Thanks, Sarah. And just so everybody on this call knows, we are going to have an opportunity tomorrow to learn more in depth about the Humanitarian Data Centers approach and also the Humanitarian Data Exchange, and to kind of brainstorm together whether this is a model for the prevention and peace building field, or if it's, you know, there are adaptations that might make something like this useful for us. So I invite all of you to that. So now we've drilled down a little bit into applications, and we've reflected on that. Now let's turn to reflecting a bit more on people, right? Because we do want this, we emphasized the people-centered nature of this. This is solutions for people. It's solving practical challenges for people, and also on reflect a bit on context. And so for this, I want to go over to Angela and to Patrick, and really ask them to reflect a bit on, you know, how does the context, you know, fragile and conflict affected context shape opportunities and challenges and risks for emerging technologies? Are there ways in which we learn more from these kinds of contexts or from working with these kinds of groups, and that we can use that to adapt and improve? But also, what are some of the challenges? So Angela, let me come to you first to reflect a little bit on people-centered approaches and the context here that we're talking about.
Thanks, Paige. I think thinking about the first part of your question, I think there's definitely an opportunity to learn more from risky situations, just because there are certain problems that will end up being surfaced in that case than would be in less risky situations. And of course, knowledge sharing and lessons learned from that would be extremely valuable, even in cases where it's not risky. And then tackling the second part, I think being able to learn, or knowledge sharing and lessons learned from similar contexts, is definitely valuable in being able to identify common trends that can then serve as a blueprint for future interventions. But I must also share a word of caution, because there's the risk of trying to take what worked in one region and applying it in exactly the same way in the hopes that that will work there. And it's important to recognize that as much as situations may be similar, each context has its own specificities. And we benefit from learning how to adapt those solutions to specific contexts, rather than trying to apply the same strategies across the board. And I think that's what the value of the open movement also provides in that case.
Thanks a lot, Angela. So I'm interested to hear that you do think that many lessons can be learned in riskier contexts, but of course we have to be careful in how we use those lessons. Patrick, what are your thoughts on this?
Let me first say that, and it might seem obvious, but I would argue that knowing people better, knowing the context better, has been one of the major gains that has been achieved through technology, especially in fact in constrained environment, because we're able to draw on so many different sensors and new ways of measuring and assessing things. We have all worked on these projects. Whether Robert just mentioned some of the misinformation, Sarah's work, our work both with Global Toolbox, with the Data Pop Alliance on using CDRs, for example. All these show the incredibly new abilities we have to gain insights into both people and context. But one of the key lessons learned is, one, we're not very good still at understanding some of the limitations, some of the exclusion that are reflected in those data, the bias, basically. We know they are there. We're not necessarily very good at addressing them or figuring out how to go around it. Second, these by and large are again very extractive, very exclusionary. In fact, it's contributing to this sense that we can do things remotely, that we don't need the local. And I see time and times again things like simple helpline being set up on the phone because you don't need to be there in person. But the reality is your qualitative insight, what you get through in face-to-face interaction, is very, very different. It's not better, it's just that you get different kind of insight. And so there's really importance here in trying to better localize, again, I use that word, it's not a great word, but building on that context. I got two more things I really quickly want to say on this. One is that, again, despite this availability of data, another lessons learned is well known, the decision gap. It doesn't mean that this is actually changing what is done on the ground. And it takes a lot more efforts to translate this data into actionable insights, into decision maker, consumable, if you like, for an impact. And very often we're focused on the technology part, which I would argue again is probably the easiest part. Finally, one thing I did want to mention is, because you talked about people, and when we think about people, we think about the community, the people that are of concern, but there are also people within our organization, the people who are using the technology. And very often we see also that organization in our work, when we do our evaluation assessments and engage with partners, they say, oh yeah, we rolled out the technology, which basically means we made the tool available, we gave a 1-week training, and we were expecting people to use things and do new things. It really falls short of considering true change management and how the technology can fundamentally change how we are doing things. Robert was mentioning some of those analysts. Well, clearly, yes, the role of analysis has to change. And it's not just adding this new tools, but really reflecting more fundamentally on how things are done, if you like. And it's more and more critical because the complexity of the technology is increasing, but the basic digital literacy is not. And so we are really kind of having those diverging trends that we need to confront fast. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. And Patrick and Angela, I mean, I'd like to come back at some point, if not now, later in the discussion around this issue of the extractive quality and where you see sort of good models for avoiding that. So we talk about localization, local approaches, putting people and communities at the center. So what's really been a good model for that? And I don't know if you have an answer now for that, but maybe we can. Patrick, do you have one?
I mean, I can certainly share an experience, which is what we have done, which is to just go back and co-create recommendations, for example, with the communities whose data we're using. So yes, there is an extractive part of the collection side and then the analysis side, but then it's about going back and in a very neutral way saying, look, this is what we heard. Does it reflect your experience? What do you think of what people have said? And then what do you think needs to be done about it? And really that dialogue is possible. It's possible within very short time frame. I very often, or the humanitarian cycle is short. In peace building, we know we're dealing with protracted conflict. There is room. There is possibilities to do that. It's actually just incremental work, but to make sure that we have that dialogue around the outcome. We have an entire cycle. What we do is from the conception of questionnaires all the way to these recommendations. We have all these consultation steps that we take.
Yeah, and this is really for me, a clear overlapping space between peace building, prevention, and humanitarian. Angela, I think you also had an idea here, and then Sarah after you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my experience also resonates strongly with Patrick's. The whole premise behind Ushahidi is yes, one element is elevating the voices of the marginalized people who traditionally wouldn't be involved in the decision-making process. But then another really important bit is closing out the feedback loop, making sure that there's feedback being sent back to them after they've shared the information, that they're able to see the value of them, what the value of them sharing does, and how them being able to raise their voices and speak about issues that are affecting them leads to decisions being made that are representative of what they actually need.
Yeah, I think that's critical. And I mean, from a peace building and prevention perspective, we often think of the importance of grievance mechanisms being available to everybody. And so if we can use technology in a way that makes that available, people's voices can be elevated and heard, and they feel that they are having a voice, I think that can help. Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, just to add that this idea of being extractive was something that we were very mindful of in the beginning, especially as a global data platform. And so we have I think, interesting model for how we're set up. We have a few people here in The Hague, but then we have people really all over the world. So a couple in Dakar who are working with our OCHA office there, and two in Nairobi. We have someone in Jakarta, someone now in Bangkok, and really just so that we could build those local trust networks. I mean, I actually remember going to the Ushahidi office early on in 2014 and really trying to understand, what is the community here and how can we build trust and partnership, and where is the collaboration? We used to have the people that we had in Nairobi, actually two days a week, they would be in sort of an innovation hub, and two, they would be in the sort of UN office. So that's one, I think that's helpful. And now we just hired a new HDX community manager. This is the first time we've actually had that type of a specific role. So Tony Burke is joining us today. He's based in Bangkok and really trying to do more in terms of engagement. So it isn't just get your data on and then, thank you and goodbye, but really, like, how can we work with you to improve the data? And can we build some visuals, and can we promote your data? And one of our fellows over the summer did some research on the idea of a premier status program for organizations that are sharing high quality data. How can we continue to incentivize that through, I don't know what, we haven't figured it out yet, but ways to bring these people together more, and then feel more involved in our community, both globally and at the field level. So hopefully that's helpful.
It is, Sarah. Thanks a lot. So we have about 10 minutes left now. I want to make sure we have some time for envisioning the future, facing the future together, hopefully. So Robert, I'd like to come back to you first. We've talked about working across the nexus and how difficult that is in a kind of practical sense, but everybody recognizes that there is a link between, diverse actors, and an emphasis on the need to work together to meet people's needs more effectively, to mitigate risks of all kinds that are compounding, cascading, whatever the word of the day is. So two questions here, and I'll go to Robert first, and then I'll come to the rest of the panel. But I mean, practically, what do you think needs to be done to increase opportunities to learn lessons across sectors? And also, second, what are some examples, maybe from your own work, from your own organization, of effective collaboration, with other actors, including private sector? What are some of the private or positive examples of that?
Sure. I mean, I think, peace building still a nascent field, compared to humanitarian and development work in general. Relatively new discipline, and as such, standards development hasn't solidified in the same way that it has in the humanitarian sector. But with the rise of these new methods and new technologies, we do need to revisit the debates about defining positive peace. It's not just an absence of violence, but how do we measure popular sentiment? What are the proxies out there that we can look at in terms of the protest movement, and new ways to measure social cohesion. We've been working a lot in the kind of public health crisis and humanitarian space for years around different applications of network science. So this is patterns of mobility, patterns of exchange, communications, friendship relationships, and a social graph, for example. These kinds of capabilities have huge implications for the peace building space, because this isn't really about, the degree to which two different populations interact and communicate and share and visit one another physically. This is not about peace versus humanitarian versus development work. These are kind of new real-time digital information primitives, the building blocks that we're going to be able to use to understand what's happening on the ground in these very complex environments. And I think there's a huge opportunity to use these technologies for good, but to also learn some of the lessons from the humanitarian space, because just the act of exploring the applications of these new data sources and technologies has already alerted many humanitarians to the potential misuse of these kinds of capabilities, right? AI is arguably the most powerful technology ever invented, which means its potential to be game-changing in a positive way and a negative way at the same time is immense. Certainly, we've been working with many different partners over the years. I think that partly because of COVID and everything that's happening around the world, in the sense that that cohesion is falling apart and trust is broken, we're seeing companies that would never have allowed us to use their data to look at these issues around social cohesion and hate speech, risk of conflict, wanting to be part of that solution now. It was seen as too political, too much of a business risk, but there's a lot of interest in this. I think, we need institutionally going forward to really be thinking through the lens of the UN data strategy, not about our specific mandates and peace versus humanitarian versus development work, but for these kind of real-time big digital data sets, we need to be thinking systematically about how we're going to get access, what our approaches are to managing the risks that come with those data sets and these kinds of algorithms. I think I'll say in general, I think there's a huge opportunity to learn, and we need to get the communities of practice connected. We're very much looking forward to jumping in deeper into this space. We've had, since goal 16 was put in the SDGs, the demand for work around peace and conflict has exploded across the UN. We're seeing tremendous interest, and people are turning to the humanitarians because you need real-time and predictive information in this space every bit as much as you do in the humanitarian settings. So yeah, it's a very, very good moment, I think. And we've certainly seen a number of applications where we think we can, it's kind of like translational medicine. We can translate across to the peace and security space quite easily.
Great, that's very welcome insight, Robert. I want to make sure that others have time, so I'm going to ask to please limit these comments to less than 2 minutes. But I would like to ask the same question to Angela and to Sarah, really about envisioning a future that is more collaborative and filled with more partnership. How do you think we can make that happen? So Angela, to you first.
So tackling the first part, I think this idea of open knowledge and sharing platforms such as HDX and our World in Data are really, really good steps towards increasing opportunities for exchange. Examples of how that's been helpful, while they might not necessarily revolve around peace building, all the work around making data about COVID-19 available has been really, really helpful. And I think moving forward, that also still should be the model, creating platforms where people are able to share information that they have in a similar format that people can then pick and learn from would be really good. In terms of how we've approached cooperation, we try to elevate lessons from our users, from different use cases, as well as facilitating connections between interested parties. And the plan is to scale that up through meetups and community engagement platforms to enable serendipitous knowledge exchange. Thank you.
Perfect, great ideas. And then Sarah, same question to you.
Sure. I mean, I think the trick is to just put yourself with people who have different opinions and different views. This type of collaboration is great. Just having these meetings is useful. But the two things we do, one is we have an annual fellowship program. So we bring in people who aren't kind of humanitarians. They're more on the tech tech and data space and expertise. And so we learn from them every year. They usually have really interesting projects. The other is secondment. So we're part of a hub here in The Hague, but we have people come sit with us. And so, if there are partners listening and you're interested in coming and sitting with us in this space, COVID aside, we're happy to do that. Like even with the Global Pulse, we sit with UN Global Pulse in Jakarta. We have someone there who we share a staff member with. So those types of collaborations, I think you really start to learn from each other. And that's, I think, one of the first steps. The other, is reaching out, like Christina Goodness. I've learned so much from her at the Department of Peace Operations. She's doing her best to get some data up on a site and sharing it through HDX. And so those types of things, I think, really building on that and doing more of it.
Yeah, perfect. And thanks for mentioning Christina over at UNDPPA. She's going to be with us tomorrow. Actually, in those workshops that I was mentioning about envisioning, a potential hub, a data hub for prevention and peace building, similar to the one that you lead. Can I just, as a final question, turn over to Patrick and to Angela? And I want to ask about the level of ambition we should be aiming for or envisioning for the use of emerging technologies, given the risks associated with them. So, should we really be increasing our level of ambition, particularly in fragile and conflict-affected countries, with a high proportion of vulnerable groups? How do we do this in a safe and ethical way? So, Patrick, you first, and then Angela.
I don't think there's a choice, right, to scale up the ambition. For the reason I mentioned in the first part, in fact, around the strategic importance of technology, the role that it's playing. I mean, I just don't think there's a choice of scaling up the ambition. And the question is, how do we do this? And in some ways, it touches on the previous question, because, to take a slightly different take, I'm at times frightened by the very limited efforts that are put into monitoring and evaluation around technology itself. And understanding those exclusionary aspects of the use of technology, understanding the do no harm of specific application. The reality is that things are being deployed and there's very limited standard reporting around issues, problems. There are informal groups, people have experience, learn things, but it's not available. We all have our story. I am sure, and nobody wants to talk them about them, and nobody really is transparent. But if we don't learn, we're not going to be able to improve. And that touches on ethics, because we are way too satisfied with the status quo. To take a very simple example, we know that informed consent is largely meaningless the way it's done. But we do it anyway, because thinking of what else can we do, and it's just taking time, but we have to move beyond that kind of status quo. We have to really advance and push the boundaries, and so that's where the ambition is, in my opinion. And again, to add on that, are those exclusion? Who is included? Who is not included? How do we represent minorities, women? How do we, all these questions are not systematically reported on. And I think having some standardization on reporting is valuable. Having coordinating learning effort is important. I think Sarah was mentioning anticipatory action. It's become a very important area in humanitarian space. And I imagine that in the peace building space, it should be the same. We've devoted so much attention to early warning. So it's going to lead to anticipatory action, but we need to understand the consequence. We need to understand the do no harm. And so, sorry for making this long and repeating myself, but the ambition to me is around rigorous testing, monitoring, evaluation, documentation, lessons learned, knowledge management, change management within this space.
Yeah, so it's as much about capacity building on kind of on the ethics and the guardrails and the norm side as it is on the technology side. And those two things really have to go hand in hand. Angela, a final word on this issue from you, please.
I would add a caveat that that ambition has to be driven by the needs of the stakeholders first, as well as an understanding of the context. Yes, we have machine learning, AI, and all of that. But then when you think about whatever peace building strategies you're going to apply in a region that has no internet connectivity or people who aren't as data literate, the strategies you're going to employ there will be very different. And so while I do appreciate the recognition of emerging technologies and the value that they bring, that has to go hand in hand with the context and the people who are involved in that process. Secondly, when it comes to the consideration of safety and ethics, while I also appreciate that a lot of it is falling on us as people who generate or collect and manage data, we need to do more to rather take it a notch further into educating beneficiaries and people who are affected by these issues about their privacy rights, so that we're also giving them agency to take part in protecting themselves and also hold us accountable, so that it's not just our responsibility to hold ourselves accountable, that there's somebody else apart from policymakers.
I think really a perfect way to close this this brilliant panel. And I have to thank all of you again for participating, for being very frank and honest. This is a great way to set the stage for the next couple of days. So really a million thanks to the four of you for being here this morning or this afternoon in your time zone. So now I know everybody is ready to run off to the next thing, and I just wanted to highlight a few aspects of the agenda before you move. So first of all, on the agenda, you'll see we have something called lightning talks. These are short pre-recorded videos on a specific interesting application. So these are available now. If you go in the agenda and you click on them, you will be able to watch the video, you'll be able to comment in the chat. And the time in the agenda actually indicates the time when the person who created the video will actually be live, present, and able to answer questions and chat with you. But you also can go watch the videos anytime and leave comments and messages for that person to respond to. So that's what the lightning talk is. I also want to highlight, we have at 3 o'clock Eastern today, something we're calling Social Hour. This is a virtual set of discussion tables, and it's our way of recreating the kind of networking opportunities that usually you have at a physical in-person conference. So for this, you just show up, you join a table, and you're going to meet interesting people virtually. You can drop in at any time during that 60-minute window, and I promise that you won't be disappointed or bored. And then finally, again, I want to highlight those 2 workshops that are taking place tomorrow, where we're going to talk in depth and kind of co-create, imagine together whether there might be a need for something like a data hub for prevention and peace building in our world, the way that the humanitarian sector has it with the Center for Humanitarian Data. And we'll be joined by Sarah Telford's colleagues for that, as well as by Christina Goodness at UNDPPA, who is herself trying to create a data hub over at the UN. So let's meet again tomorrow and imagine what could be possible. And yes, all of this is being recorded. All of this will be made available to you after the event. In case you missed anything, you can always come back to the platform and watch anything that you missed. So with that, thanks again. Thanks to our panelists. Thanks to the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to the UN OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data. We're really looking forward to the next couple of days with you.